The Vampire King's daughter cornered a leather-clad stranger outside a blood bank, begging him to pretend he was her father for one night. But Marcus had no idea the Hell's Angel patch on his back would make ancient vampire nobility believe he commanded an army of iron and fire, or that refusing a vampire princess meant war with creatures who'd never seen a mortal say no. Marcus Reeves had seen enough blood in his 43 years to know when someone was bleeding from the inside out, and the girl in the $1,000 dress standing outside Metro Blood Services was hemorrhaging desperation from every pore. Her pale fingers trembled against his leather jacket, manicured nails clicking against the metal studs, as she whispered words that should have sent him walking but instead made him pause mid-stride toward his Harley. "Please pretend you're my dad." The streetlight carved shadows across her face, highlighting cheekbones sharp enough to cut glass and eyes the color of winter storms. Marcus had been propositioned by plenty of rich girls looking to piss off daddy, but this one smelled wrong, like expensive perfume trying to mask something metallic and ancient. The briefcase in her other hand gleamed silver under the fluorescent glow spilling from the blood bank's windows, and when she popped it open with a soft click, Marcus counted more cash than he'd seen outside of a drug deal gone sideways. $30,000 in neat stacks, crisp hundreds bound with rubber bands that looked like they'd never seen the inside of a bank vault. The girl's voice cracked when she spoke again, revealing an accent that belonged in old movies about European royalty, something cultured and refined that sat strangely on someone who couldn't be older than 20. "My father will kill anyone who disappoints me tonight, and I need someone who looks like they could fight back." Marcus's laugh came out harsh and disbelieving because he'd heard that line before from mob princesses and cartel daughters, but the way she said kill made his spine prickle with recognition. This wasn't teenage drama or daddy issues wrapped in designer rebellion. This was the kind of fear that came from knowing exactly what death looked like and understanding that it was coming whether you were ready or not. The sirens in the distance grew louder, and Marcus caught sight of the girl's reflection in the blood bank window, noting how the glass seemed to swallow her image like she wasn't entirely there. When she grabbed his forearm to emphasize her next words, her grip left impressions that would bruise by morning, strength that belonged to someone twice her size and 3 times her apparent age. The scent of old copper pennies clung to her skin beneath the designer fragrance, and Marcus recognized it from emergency rooms and crime scenes, the particular smell of blood that had been spilled and cleaned but never quite forgotten. Her story tumbled out in fragments between glances at her diamond-crusted watch, a tale of ancient laws and arranged marriages that sounded like something from a history book about medieval princes and political alliances. She spoke of a father who commanded respect through fear and a betrothal ceremony that would seal her fate to a man whose name she whispered like a curse. "Lord Valerian," she said, and the way the syllables fell from her lips made Marcus think of winter graveyards and things that fed in darkness. The girl claimed her name was Seraphina, princess of a bloodline that stretched back centuries, and she'd told her father lies about having a mortal guardian who would object to her being married off like property. Now those lies were coming home to roost, and she had 30 minutes to produce a father figure or face consequences that made her hands shake when she tried to explain them. Marcus studied her face in the harsh streetlight, noting how her skin seemed too pale for someone who claimed to be 20, translucent enough that he could see delicate blue veins tracing patterns beneath the surface. Her breathing came too shallow and too controlled, like someone consciously remembering to perform an action that should be automatic. When she smiled, trying to convince him to take the job, her canine teeth caught the light with a sharpness that sent warning bells clanging through his skull. 20 years of riding with the Hells Angels had taught Marcus to recognize predators in human clothing, but this girl was something else entirely, something that made his instincts scream danger while his conscience argued for protection. The cash meant freedom from the mechanic shop where he'd been pulling double shifts to cover his brother's medical bills, but the job itself felt like stepping into quicksand, with weights tied to his ankles. Still, when Seraphina's façade cracked, and he glimpsed the terror beneath her composed mask, Marcus found himself nodding before his brain could list all the reasons this was a spectacularly bad idea. The girl's relief hit him like a physical force, and she pressed the briefcase into his hands with fingers that felt cold as winter morning metal. She explained the rules in rapid-fire sentences that sounded like survival instructions, telling him that vampires existed in the shadows of the human world, governed by laws older than any government and infinitely more brutal in their enforcement. Her father believed mortals were insects unless they commanded power and territory, and she'd convinced him that her protector led a motorcycle brotherhood that controlled smuggling routes across 3 states. The Hells Angels patch on Marcus's back, she explained, would sell the story better than any acting could manage, because vampire nobility understood hierarchy and respected strength above all else. As they walked toward his Harley, Serafina's heels clicked against wet pavement with mechanical precision, each step measured and deliberate like someone who'd learned to move, without making sound. She climbed onto the bike behind him with surprising familiarity, settling against his back with the kind of practiced ease that suggested this wasn't her first midnight ride. Her arms wrapped around his waist, and Marcus felt the absence where her heartbeat should have been, a silence that made his skin crawl with recognition of something fundamentally wrong. The Drackle estate lay 20 miles outside the city, accessible only through winding mountain roads that disappeared into fog thick as cotton batting. As they rode through the darkness, Marcus caught glimpses of the tail following them in his mirrors, sleek black sedans with windows tinted dark enough to hide anything that might be riding inside. The cars moved with predatory patience, keeping pace but never closing distance, like wolves following a wounded deer through territory they owned absolutely. Serafina's grip tightened when they passed through electronic gates that opened without any visible signal, and Marcus felt her tension ratchet higher with each twist of the mountain road. The mansion materialized through the fog like something from a Gothic nightmare, all pointed towers and iron spires that clawed at the low-hanging clouds. Gargoyles perched along the roofline with expressions of perpetual hunger, their stone eyes following the Harley's progress up the circular drive. Windows glowed with warm yellow light that seemed somehow wrong against the building's dark stone, as if the illumination came from sources other than electricity. Marcus killed the engine in front of massive oak doors, bound with iron straps that looked older than the country itself, and the sudden silence felt heavy with watching eyes and held breath. Serafina slid off the bike with fluid grace, her designer dress somehow unmarked despite the ride, and when she looked back at him, her eyes reflected the mansion's light like a cat's in darkness. The briefcase felt heavier in Marcus's hands as he followed her toward doors that opened before they could knock, revealing a foyer that belonged in a European palace rather than a California hillside. Crystal chandeliers cast rainbow shadows across marble floors that had been worn smooth by centuries of footsteps, and portraits in gilded frames watched their approach with painted eyes that seemed to track movement. The scent hit Marcus as they crossed the threshold, a mixture of old roses and older blood, incense and something else that made his nostrils flare with instinctive recognition of predator territory. Serafina's hand found his elbow as servants materialized from the shadows, pale figures in formal attire who moved with the same unsettling grace as their mistress. They took Marcus's jacket with reverent care, noting the Hells Angels patch with glances that carried weight and meaning, while Serafina straightened her dress and transformed from desperate teenager into something that belonged in this place of ancient power and barely contained violence. The Vampire King's daughter had found her father for the night, but as Marcus followed her deeper into the mansion's shadowed halls, he realized that playing this role might cost him more than he'd ever imagined possible, and the road that had brought him here would never lead him safely home again. The ballroom stretched before Marcus like a cathedral dedicated to shadows and power, its vaulted ceiling disappearing into darkness, while crystal chandeliers cast fractured light across faces that belonged in museum paintings about forgotten royalty. Vampire King Lucian Dracul commanded the space from a throne carved from obsidian that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, his presence filling the room with the kind of absolute authority that made hardened criminals look away and crosses themselves. Marcus had faced down rival gang leaders and federal agents, but walking into this assembly felt like entering a den where every occupant could tear him apart without breaking conversation. The Vampire King appeared younger than his daughter, maybe 35, with the kind of classical features that suggested centuries of careful breeding, but his eyes held depths that spoke of ages beyond human comprehension. Dark hair fell in waves past shoulders, clothed in a suit that probably cost more than Marcus's bike, and when those ancient eyes fixed on the newcomers, the temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Ancient nobles lined the walls like living statues, their faces bearing the marble perfection of death masks, while their eyes tracked movement with predatory interest. They whispered in languages that predated English, their voices carrying the rustling quality of autumn leaves or settling bones, and Marcus caught fragments that sounded like Latin mixed with something older and more guttural. The winged skull patch on his leather vest drew their attention like iron filings to a magnet, and he heard them murmur about the mortal who rides with death and the angel of iron roads, titles that made his spine straighten with recognition that his reputation had somehow preceded him into this nightmare court. Serafina moved beside him with the fluid grace of someone born to these marble halls, her earlier desperation replaced by the controlled composure of royalty walking among subjects who would die for her or kill her with equal devotion. She wore her princess mask like armor, every gesture calculated to project strength while her fingers brushed against Marcus's arm in signals they'd hastily arranged during the ride up the mountain. When she spoke, her voice carried across the ballroom with crystal clarity, introducing Marcus as her father and protector, the leader of a brotherhood that commanded respect across mortal territories. Marcus stepped forward with the swagger he'd perfected in biker bars and prison yards, his presence filling space the way men learn when violence is always one wrong word away. He demanded to know why his daughter was being forced into marriage without his consent, his voice carrying the gravelly authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. The words felt strange in his mouth because he'd never had children, never wanted the responsibility of protecting someone else's dreams. But something about Serafina's desperate courage made the paternal instincts feel almost natural. Lucian's interest sharpened like a blade finding its edge, and Marcus realized that the Vampire King was testing him, probing for weaknesses with the methodical precision of someone who'd spent centuries reading human nature. The throne room fell silent except for the whisper of silk and the soft tick of an antique clock that marked time in a place where time had different meaning. Marcus held the Vampire King's gaze without flinching, drawing on 20 years of stare-downs with men who killed for recreation and survived by never showing fear. His road-hardened nerves served him well in this moment, mistaken by ancient eyes for supernatural resistance rather than simple human stubbornness. Lord Valerian emerged from the shadows like smoke given form, and Marcus understood immediately why Serafina feared this creature more than death itself. The vampire moved with liquid grace that suggested centuries of hunting practice, his pale features carved with the kind of cruel beauty that belonged on fallen angels in medieval paintings. When he smiled, fangs caught the light like ivory daggers, and his eyes held the cold calculation of someone who viewed other beings as possessions to be acquired and discarded. Valerian's voice carried a cultured accent that made every word sound like a threat wrapped in silk, and when he spoke of claiming his bride, the possessive hunger in his tone made Marcus's hands curl into fists. The formal dinner that followed tested Marcus's ability to maintain his deception while navigating social customs that felt like walking through a minefield blindfolded. Serafina guided him with subtle touches and whispered instructions, teaching him which fork to use and when to stand. But the real challenge lay in projecting confidence while surrounded by predators who could smell fear like blood in water. The dining hall stretched longer than some city blocks, its mahogany table polished to mirror brightness and set with silver that gleamed like captured moonlight. Servants moved with the same predatory grace as their masters, filling wine glasses with liquid that tasted metallic and warming, leaving an aftertaste that reminded Marcus of pennies and iron. Every conversation carried undercurrents of threat and alliance. Ancient politics played out in seemingly casual remarks about territory and bloodlines and debts that stretched back centuries. Marcus found himself seated between a countess who claimed to have danced at Versailles and a baron whose pale scars suggested he'd survived more than one assassination attempt. They spoke of mortal affairs with the detached interest of scientists studying insects, discussing human governments and economies like weather patterns that occasionally affected their plans. When Lucian questioned Marcus about his territory and brotherhood, the biker drew on real Hell's Angels hierarchy to create believable answers, describing chapters and prospects, and the intricate web of loyalty and violence that bound his brothers together. He spoke of highways and bars and the kind of respect that came from proving yourself worthy through action rather than birthright. And something in his voice convinced the Vampire King that this mortal understood power in ways that transcended species. The turning point came when Valerian made the mistake of testing Marcus's resolve, suggesting with silken contempt that mortals who played at being wolves often forgot they were really sheep, dressed in leather and false courage. The room went silent as a tomb, every conversation stopping mid-sentence, while ancient eyes focused on the confrontation brewing between predator and prey. Marcus felt the familiar calm that preceded violence, the cold focus that had kept him alive through bar fights and gang wars, and the kind of desperate encounters where hesitation meant bleeding out on pavement. He leaned back in his chair with deliberate casualness, letting his voice drop to the quiet register that made smart men step back and stupid ones reach for weapons. His words cut through the silence like steel through silk, informing Valerian that his daughter wouldn't marry anyone who showed disrespect to her family, and that any man who couldn't treat a woman with dignity probably couldn't handle what came with challenging someone who'd earned his patch through blood and time. The threat wasn't subtle, and Marcus made no effort to disguise the promise of violence that lay beneath his controlled tone. He'd learned long ago that respect came from demonstrating you were willing to fight for what mattered, even when the odds suggested you shouldn't survive the encounter. Lucian's approval rippled through the room like heat from a furnace, and Marcus realized that the Vampire King valued strength above courtesy, respected those who defended their own even against impossible odds. But as the dinner continued and conversations resumed their deadly undercurrents, Marcus began to understand that he'd walked into something far more complex and dangerous than a simple family dispute. These creatures played games where the stakes were measured in centuries rather than years, where alliance and betrayal danced together like lovers in the shadows, and where one wrong move could destroy not just him, but everyone he'd ever cared about. The weight of deception pressed against his shoulders like a physical burden as he maintained his role throughout courses of food that looked beautiful and tasted of things he couldn't identify. Seraphina's hand found his under the table during the final toast, her fingers cold as winter morning, but steady with the kind of courage that came from knowing you were already walking through hell and deciding to keep moving forward. When Lucian raised his glass and spoke of family bonds and the sacred duty of protecting those who shared your blood, Marcus lifted his own glass and met the Vampire King's eyes with the steady gaze of someone who understood that some promises, once made, could never be taken back. The wine burned down his throat like liquid fire, and as applause echoed through the dining hall, Marcus realized that his performance had been too convincing, that he'd crossed a line from pretending to care about Seraphina to actually meaning every word he'd spoken in her defense, and that this transformation would make what came next either salvation or the most expensive mistake of his life. And now's the time to stop and subscribe to our channel. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these tales travel across the world. Now let's continue. The Vampire King's announcement fell across the dining hall like a blade cutting silk, his voice carrying the weight of ancient law as he declared that no betrothal could proceed without witnessing the sacred bond between father and daughter through ritual older than written history. Marcus felt ice form in his stomach as Lucian's words registered, understanding that whatever test lay ahead would either cement their deception or expose it with consequences that made death look merciful. Seraphina's fingers tightened against his hand beneath the table, her pulse absent, but her fear tangible as servants materialized to escort them from the dining hall toward chambers deeper in the mansion's shadowed heart. The corridor they traveled stretched like a throat swallowing them into darkness, lit by candles that flickered without wind and cast shadows that moved independently of their sources. Ancient portraits watched their passage with painted eyes that seemed to follow movement, and Marcus caught glimpses of faces that bore Seraphina's features across centuries of careful breeding. The chamber they entered felt more like a chapel than a room, its walls carved with symbols that hurt to look at directly, while an altar dominated the space, with the kind of presence that suggested countless rituals performed in darkness. Lucian positioned himself like a priest preparing for communion, his pale hands arranging items on the altar with ceremonial precision while explaining that vampire bonds required blood to validate their truth. Marcus realized with growing horror that this wasn't symbolic, that Seraphina would have to feed from him in front of her father to prove their connection, and that failure would mean exposure followed by whatever punishment the Vampire King reserved for those who dared deceive his court. Seraphina's confession came in, whispers that barely reached his ears, as servants withdrew to give them privacy for preparation, her voice breaking as she admitted she'd never fed from a living human before, because royal vampires sustained themselves on donated blood collected by their servants. The vulnerability in her admission cut through Marcus's growing panic, revealing the girl beneath the princess mask as someone who'd been sheltered from the very nature that defined her species. She spoke of blood banks and medical donations, of sustaining herself on life freely given rather than taken by force. And Marcus understood that this ritual would violate something fundamental in her nature as surely as it terrified him. When he offered his wrist without hesitation, rolling up his sleeve to expose skin marked by road scars and old tattoos, Seraphina's tears fell like crystal raindrops that caught candlelight and shattered into rainbow fragments. Her fangs extended with reluctant precision, ivory needles that had never pierced living flesh. And when she looked into his eyes seeking permission, Marcus nodded with the kind of trust that surprised them both. The pain was sharp and clean, like surgical steel breaking skin, but the sensation that followed transcended physical experience and became something that rewrote the fundamental nature of consciousness itself. Marcus felt Seraphina's presence flood his mind, like warm water filling empty spaces, her memories and emotions cascading through his awareness with the force of revelation. He experienced centuries of loneliness that stretched like desert landscapes, endless years of existing among creatures who saw her as princess first and person never, if at all. Her terror of Valerian crashed over him in waves of nausea and despair, showing him flashes of the vampire lord's casual cruelty and predatory hunger that viewed her as possession rather than partner. Marcus lived her desperate attempts to find purpose beyond royal duty, her secret acts of kindness toward humans who'd been damaged by vampire carelessness, her growing understanding that she wanted to be protector rather than princess. The psychic connection flowed both ways, and Marcus felt Seraphina experience his own memories with the same devastating intimacy. She saw his brother Danny's death through his eyes, the night that changed everything, and set him searching for answers in places where shadows held more truth than daylight. She experienced his years on the road with the Hell's Angels, the brotherhood forged through shared danger and mutual protection, the code that valued loyalty above comfort and courage above safety. Through his memories, she understood why he'd agreed to help her, recognizing the protective instinct that drove him to stand between predators and their prey regardless of personal cost. When the feeding ended and they separated, both carried pieces of each other that couldn't be extracted or forgotten, a bond more intimate than blood and stronger than fear. Lucian's ancient eyes studied them as they emerged from the chamber, and Marcus knew that the vampire king sensed the change in their connection, the transformation from desperate performance to genuine relationship. The ritual had accomplished its purpose in ways none of them anticipated, creating something real from deception and forging alliance from necessity. Elena appeared at Marcus's side as the court prepared to retire, her presence announced by the whisper of silk and the subtle scent of roses preserved beyond their natural season. The ancient vampire moved with grace that spoke of centuries spent navigating political currents more dangerous than battlefield warfare. And when she guided Marcus toward a private alcove overlooking the mansion's gardens, he understood that this conversation would carry weight far beyond casual courtesy. Elena's appearance suggested someone who'd been beautiful when humanity was young, her features carved with classical perfection, while her eyes held depths that made him think of libraries filled with secrets and wisdom earned through surviving ages that would have broken lesser minds. She served as court historian and had tutored Serafina through centuries of education, understanding the princess better than anyone, except perhaps the king himself. When Elena spoke of Valerian's true intentions, her voice carried the careful neutrality of someone who'd learned to navigate treacherous waters by never revealing which current carried her true loyalty. She explained how the vampire lord had been consolidating power through strategic marriages, binding noble houses to his cause through alliances that looked beneficial on the surface, but contained clauses that transferred authority to him over time. His interest in Serafina went beyond her beauty or bloodline, to encompass her position as heir to Lucian's throne, making their union the final step in a plan years in the making. Elena's warning about Lucian's suspicions came wrapped in careful phrasing that suggested the Vampire King's legendary intuition was working against Marcus despite his successful performance during dinner. Something about the mortal intrigued Lucian in ways that went beyond his daughter's protection, and Elena advised that continued scrutiny would eventually reveal truths that could prove fatal for everyone involved. Meanwhile, Serafina sought Marcus out in the mansion's library, finding him among shelves that stretched toward vaulted ceilings lined with books bound in leather and metal, and materials that didn't bear close examination. The princess had changed from her formal dinner attire into something that belonged to this century, jeans and a sweater that made her look more like the college student she'd never been than the ancient royalty she'd been born to become. Her confession came easier in this private space, words flowing like water through a broken dam as she explained her secret work protecting humans who'd been damaged by vampire carelessness or deliberate cruelty. She spoke of blood donors drained too deeply by nobles who viewed humans as renewable resources, of victims left traumatized by encounters with creatures who considered mortal memory and sanity irrelevant to their feeding needs. Using her position and inherited wealth, Serafina had established networks that provided medical care and psychological support for those damaged by supernatural predators, operating in shadows that even vampire society couldn't penetrate. Marcus recognized something familiar in her words, the protective instinct that drove people to stand between predators and prey, regardless of personal cost or social expectation. Her work reminded him of his own brothers who'd served as unofficial guardians for their communities, using reputation and violence to discourage the kind of human predators who targeted the vulnerable and defenseless. The bond forged during their bloodsharing deepened as they talked, two protectors finding common ground in their willingness to fight for those who couldn't fight for themselves. Neither noticed the pale figure listening from doorway shadows, one of Valerian's many servants tasked with gathering information that could be weaponized when political necessity demanded action. The spy retreated into mansion corridors with enough material to begin the kind of investigation that would either confirm Marcus's legitimacy or expose the deception that protected Serafina from a marriage that would destroy everything she'd worked to build. Valerian's network operated with efficiency learned through centuries of practice, reaching into databases and records with tentacles that stretched across continents and decades. They would learn about Marcus Reeves and his Hells Angels brothers, about the night his brother died, and the years he'd spent hunting answers in places where humans feared to look. They would discover the truth about his background and motivations, and that knowledge would become a weapon aimed at the heart of Seraphina's desperate gamble. As dawn approached and the mansion's residents prepared for daylight rest, Marcus found himself standing at a window that overlooked grounds shrouded in morning mist. The ritual had changed him in ways he couldn't yet comprehend, creating connections that transcended the physical feeding to establish bonds that felt more real than anything he'd experienced in 20 years of brotherhood and brotherhood. Seraphina joined him at the window as sunrise painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, her reflection absent from the glass, while his presence seemed somehow diminished, as if sharing blood had made him partially transparent to the natural world. They stood together watching light drive shadows from the gardens, both understanding that the game they'd entered was larger and more dangerous than either had imagined, and that the choices made in the coming hours would determine whether their desperate alliance became salvation or the foundation for a war that would consume everything they'd tried to protect. Valerian's investigation bore fruit with the methodical precision of a scalpel peeling back layers of flesh to expose bone, his network of informants and hackers working through the night to uncover every detail of Marcus Reeves's existence, from birth certificate to prison records to the tragic police report filed 15 years ago in a small Colorado town where a young man named Danny Reeves had been found torn apart behind a roadhouse bar. The official cause of death read wild animal attack, but the crime scene photos told a different story to eyes trained in supernatural predation, revealing bite marks too precise and calculated for any earthly creature, wounds inflicted with surgical precision rather than bestial fury. Marcus had been 28 when his younger brother died, already a member of the Hells Angels, but not yet the road-hardened veteran who would spend the next decade and a half hunting through shadows for answers that police couldn't provide and coroners wouldn't acknowledge. The investigation revealed hospital records from emergency rooms across 3 states, documenting Marcus's numerous injuries from encounters that medical professionals couldn't explain, wounds that suggested he'd tangled with things that possessed supernatural strength and left claw marks that didn't match any known predator. Valerian's spies uncovered a pattern of Marcus appearing in towns where unexplained deaths had been quietly covered up by authorities who preferred comfortable lies to impossible truths, his Harley's engine roaring away from crime scenes that bore the signatures of vampire attacks, or werewolf maulings, or things that existed in nightmares rather than nature. The vampire lord's smile was sharp as winter steel when his servants presented evidence that Marcus Reeves had been hunting supernatural predators for years, developing instincts and knowledge that kept him alive through encounters that should have killed him dozens of times over. His Hells Angels chapter operated in territory where creatures of darkness fed on human prey, and Marcus had unknowingly served as their guardian, using reputation and violence to discourage predators who preferred easy victims to dangerous ones. The accumulated evidence painted a picture of a man who dedicated his life to protecting innocents from monsters, making him either the most dangerous hunter ever to infiltrate vampire society or the perfect ally for a princess who shared his protective instincts. Valerian chose to interpret the evidence as threat rather than opportunity, presenting his findings to Lucian with the carefully modulated enthusiasm of a prosecutor delivering closing arguments to a jury already convinced of the defendant's guilt. The Vampire King's rage erupted like a volcano that had been building pressure for centuries, his fury shaking the mansion's foundations while servants fled from corridors, suddenly filled with the kind of supernatural wrath that could stop hearts and shatter minds. Crystal chandeliers swayed despite the absence of wind, and portraits throughout the mansion began bleeding from painted eyes as Lucian's power escaped his control and infected the very structure of his domain. Marcus felt the vampire king's anger like a physical force pressing against his chest, making breathing difficult, while the temperature in the library dropped until frost began forming on the windows, despite the California climate. Serafina stood frozen between her father's fury and her protector's growing understanding that their deception had been exposed in the worst possible way, torn between loyalty to family and devotion to the man who'd risked everything to protect her from a marriage she couldn't escape alone. The confrontation took place in the ballroom where they'd first met, with Lucian's voice carrying the weight of absolute authority as he demanded explanations for Marcus's presence in his court. Valerian presented his evidence with the theatrical flair of someone who enjoyed watching enemies squirm before delivering killing blows, describing Marcus's history of supernatural encounters, while suggesting that hunter infiltration represented the worst possible threat to vampire society. The assembled nobility whispered among themselves with the hungry anticipation of spectators at gladiatorial games, their ancient faces reflecting centuries of boredom finally broken by drama that promised blood and betrayal in equal measure. Marcus stood silent under the vampire king's scrutiny, understanding that any words he spoke would either dig his grave deeper or provide ammunition for enemies who'd already decided his fate. The truth was more complex than Valerian's presentation suggested, but nuance had no place in a court where suspicion meant death, and explanation was often considered admission of guilt. When Lucian demanded to know if Marcus had come to his court as hunter rather than father, the question hung in air thick with supernatural tension and the promise of violence that would make medieval executions look merciful by comparison. Serafina's choice came with the desperate speed of someone throwing themselves between a bullet and its intended target, her voice cutting through her father's rage with words that invoked laws older than any nation and more binding than blood itself. She claimed Marcus as her blood-sworn guardian under protections that dated back to the earliest vampire courts, declaring that his life was forfeit to hers and hers to his in bonds that could only be severed by death or mutual betrayal. The ancient law she invoked was rarely used because it required the claimant to stake their own existence on their champion's loyalty, creating a connection that made treachery mutually destructive. If Marcus proved false to vampire interests, both he and Serafina would face execution. But the law also granted him legal standing to speak and act in her defense against any who would harm her. The court fell silent as nobility who remembered the law's creation exchanged glances that mixed surprise with calculation, understanding that Serafina had just transformed Marcus from suspected enemy into legal family member with rights that even Lucian couldn't violate without violating his own court's foundations. Valerian's fury at this development was barely contained beneath his cultured façade, his plans for political advancement through marriage, suddenly complicated by legal protections that made attacking Marcus equivalent to attacking Serafina herself. The vampire lord's response came with the calculated cruelty of someone who understood that legal maneuvering could be countered by physical force, his demand for trial by combat echoing through the ballroom with the weight of ancient tradition that even protective laws couldn't override. Under vampire court tradition, any member of the nobility could challenge another to single combat when honor or truth was in dispute, and Valerian's challenge carried the implicit suggestion that Marcus's victory would prove his worthiness, while defeat would expose his deception. The vampire lord's confidence was evident in every gesture as he explained the terms of engagement, expecting to easily destroy a mortal who might have survived encounters with supernatural predators through luck and preparation, but couldn't match centuries of vampire strength and speed in formal combat. Marcus accepted the challenge before Serafina could object, understanding that refusing would validate every accusation while fighting offered at least the possibility of survival and vindication. His decision silenced the court's whispers as nobility who'd dismissed him as curious anomaly suddenly realized they were witnessing something unprecedented in their long existences. The preparations for trial by combat began with ceremonial efficiency as servants cleared the ballroom floor and arranged torches that would provide proper illumination for the coming spectacle. Ancient weapons were brought from the mansion's armory, blades forged in darker ages when vampire courts settled disputes through blood rather than politics, though Valerian would fight with natural advantages that no weapon could balance. Marcus was offered his choice of armaments from a collection that included swords blessed by forgotten priests and daggers carved from materials that existed nowhere in the mortal world. But his hands settled on the iron chain from his motorcycle and the silver skull ring that had been his companion through 20 years of brotherhood and violence. The court buzzed with anticipation as word spread through the mansion that a mortal would face vampire nobility in single combat, with stakes that included not just his own life, but the princess who'd claimed him as guardian. Ancient creatures who'd witnessed the rise and fall of empires gathered to watch a confrontation that would either validate their assumptions about human weakness or force them to reconsider everything they believed about the prey they'd hunted for centuries. Elena found Marcus in the hour before combat, her ancient eyes reflecting centuries of wisdom, as she offered advice that came from watching countless warriors prepare for battles they couldn't win. She spoke of vampire weaknesses that textbooks didn't mention, of strategies that might give mortal determination an edge against supernatural advantage, of the importance of fighting not just for victory, but for the principles that made victory meaningful. Meanwhile, Serafina paced her chambers like a caged wolf, understanding that her desperate gamble had transformed their deception into something that transcended performance and became truth. She'd staked her existence on Marcus's character, and whether he won or lost, their fates were now intertwined in ways that would either save them both or destroy them together. As midnight approached and the court assembled for combat that would determine the future of vampire politics and human supernatural relations, Marcus stood in the ballroom's center, feeling the weight of every decision that had brought him to this moment. The chain in his hands felt heavier than iron, weighted with the responsibility of protecting someone who'd become more real to him than his own survival, while the silver ring on his finger carried the accumulated luck and determination of a man who'd spent 15 years hunting monsters and finally found one worth saving rather than killing. The ancient courtyard stretched like an amphitheater carved from nightmares, its stone walls rising toward stars that seemed dimmed by the supernatural tension crackling through air thick enough to taste. Torches mounted on iron brackets cast dancing shadows that writhed across faces gathered to witness combat that would either validate centuries of vampire superiority or shatter assumptions about mortal weakness that had shaped their society since its bloody inception. Marcus stood in the courtyard's center, feeling cobblestones worn smooth by ages of violence beneath his boots, the iron chain from his Harley coiled in hands that had learned to kill through necessity rather than choice, while the silver skull ring caught torchlight with the promise of blessed metal against unholy flesh. Valerian entered the combat circle with predatory grace that made watching nobles lean forward in anticipation, his pale form moving with liquid precision while removing his formal jacket to reveal a physique carved from marble and tempered by centuries of supernatural strength. The vampire lord's confidence radiated like heat from a forge, as he smiled with fangs that gleamed like ivory daggers in the flickering light, his eyes reflecting flames with the hungry anticipation of someone who'd grown bored with easy victories and relished the opportunity to toy with prey before delivering death. Lucian's voice echoed across stone walls as he formally began the trial, his words carrying the weight of laws written in blood and enforced through terror, declaring that combat would continue until one participant yielded or died, and that victory would determine truth in matters where deception clouded justice. The Vampire King's ancient authority filled the space like a physical presence, while assembled nobility held collective breath, understanding that they were witnessing something that would be whispered about in their courts for centuries to come, regardless of its outcome. Marcus felt time slow as Valerian began his attack, superhuman speed turning the vampire into blur of motion that should have ended the fight before mortal reflexes could respond. But 15 years of hunting supernatural predators had taught him to read movement patterns and anticipate strikes that came faster than human eyes could follow. The first exchange lasted seconds that felt like hours, Valerian's claws raking air where Marcus had been standing, while the biker rolled beneath the vampire's guard and lashed out with his chain in movements learned through decades of bar fights and prison yards, where hesitation meant bleeding out on concrete floors. Iron links bit into vampire flesh with the sharp crack of metal against bone, drawing blood that steamed in the cool night air, while Valerian's roar of pain and surprise echoed off courtyard walls. The assembled nobles shifted with collective unease as they realized this mortal wasn't dying as quickly as anticipated, that something about his movements suggested knowledge rather than luck, experience rather than desperate flailing. Marcus pressed his advantage with the methodical brutality of someone who understood that fighting fair meant dying slowly, using every dirty trick learned through survival that depended on ending threats before they could kill him. He wrapped the chain around his fist like brass knuckles made from blessed iron, feeling the metal warm against his skin as it made contact with vampire flesh and left burns that glowed like brands in the darkness. Valerian's speed was overwhelming, but Marcus had fought faster opponents in dive bars, where violence erupted without warning and survival depended on thinking 3 moves ahead while moving 2 steps faster than death itself. The tide of battle shifted when Marcus managed to hook his chain around Valerian's throat during a moment when the vampire's arrogance led him too close, iron links settling against pale skin with the hiss of metal burning undead flesh. The courtyard fell silent except for Valerian's agonized screams as iron seared vampire skin like acid, the sound echoing off stone walls, while assembled nobility realized that this ignorant mortal knew exactly what he was fighting and had come prepared for war against creatures most humans couldn't imagine. Seraphina's anguished cries from the crowd fueled Marcus's determination as he tightened his grip on the chain, feeling Valerian's strength fade as iron poisoning spread through the vampire's system, like liquid fire burning away supernatural advantages 1 degree at a time. The moment when everything changed came like lightning splitting a clear sky, sudden and brilliant and terrible in its implications, as Valerian's desperation drove him beyond the boundaries of vampire nobility into something that belonged in deeper darkness. His transformation was obscene, flesh melting and reforming into shapes that violated natural law, while bones cracked and extended into configurations that hurt to witness directly. What emerged from Valerian's human façade was something that predated vampire civilization, a creature of such ancient malevolence that even Lucian stepped backward with shock written across features that had witnessed the birth and death of empires. The thing that had been Valerian towered above Marcus, with wings like tattered leather and claws that dripped venom capable of liquefying flesh, its eyes burning with hunger that had devoured civilizations and left nothing but bones and bitter memory. Marcus understood in that moment that he'd been fighting something far more dangerous than vampire nobility, that Valerian's interest in Seraphina went beyond political ambition to encompass appetites that would have consumed her soul along with her body. The revelation gave him strength born from protective fury as he realized that this creature had been planning to inflict horrors on the girl who'd trusted him with her life and freedom. Lucian's shock at Valerian's true nature provided the distraction Marcus needed to drive his silver ring deep into the monster's chest, blessed metal piercing undead flesh like a stake driven by righteous anger and desperate love. The skull ring that had been his companion through 20 years of brotherhood and violence became a weapon of holy purpose as it found the creature's heart. Silver burning through corruption with the pure light of metal blessed by priests who'd understood the difference between protection and destruction. Valerian's death scream shattered windows throughout the mansion as his ancient form crumbled to ash that scattered on wind that carried the scent of sulfur and burned dreams, his destruction releasing centuries of accumulated malevolence into air that tasted of copper and ozone. Marcus collapsed as adrenaline faded, and blood loss from dozens of wounds finally registered, his vision graying while pain from injuries, both physical and supernatural, threatened to drag him into darkness that might prove permanent. Serafina reached him before consciousness fully faded, her hands desperate as she gathered his broken form against her chest, while tears mixed with blood that poured from wounds inflicted by claws designed to kill rather than wound. Her decision to save him came without hesitation, vampire instincts overriding royal protocols as she bit her own wrist and pressed the bleeding wound to his lips, forcing her ancient blood into his failing system with the desperate efficiency of someone who understood that seconds measured the difference between salvation and eternal loss. The transformation began immediately as vampire blood mixed with human, creating something unprecedented in either species' long history, a hybrid state that granted supernatural strength while preserving the humanity that made Marcus worth saving. His wounds began healing with visible speed while his senses expanded beyond mortal limitations, but the core of his personality remained unchanged, the protective instincts and moral compass that had driven him to risk everything for a stranger's freedom. Lucian's voice cut through the courtyard's stunned silence as he declared Marcus the victor and Serafina's rightful guardian, his words carrying acknowledgement that events had transcended simple combat to become something that would reshape vampire society's understanding of human potential. The Vampire King's ancient eyes reflected new respect as he studied the hybrid creature his daughter had created, understanding that Marcus represented possibilities neither species had imagined and challenges that would require wisdom accumulated over millennia to navigate successfully. The assembled nobility dispersed with whispered conversations that would carry news of the night's events to vampire courts across the world, spreading word that a mortal had defeated something even they feared, and that the boundaries between human and vampire were more fluid than ancient laws suggested. Marcus stood on unsteady feet with Serafina's support, feeling strength flow through muscles that had been torn and broken minutes before, while his enhanced senses registered heartbeats and breathing patterns of creatures who no longer seemed quite as alien as they had when he'd first entered this world of shadows and supernatural politics. The victory had cost them both more than either had anticipated, transforming their desperate deception into bonds that could never be severed and responsibilities that would shape the rest of their extended existences. As dawn approached, and the courtyard emptied of witnesses to history, Marcus and Serafina stood together amid scattered ash that had once been Valerian, both changed by fire and blood into something neither fully human nor completely vampire, guardians of a future that would require them to bridge worlds that had remained separate since civilization's dawn. The aftermath of Valerian's destruction brought revelations that reshaped Marcus's understanding of the supernatural world he'd unknowingly been fighting for 15 years, as Lucian's confession unveiled political complexities that made vampire courts seem more like ancient kingdoms balanced on knife edges than the monolithic power structure he'd initially imagined. The Vampire King spoke with weary authority about bloodlines that had existed since civilization's dawn, each claiming legitimacy through conquest or breeding, or pacts made in darkness when humans still cowered from shadows that held more substance than superstition. These ancient houses were fracturing under pressures both internal and external, with younger vampires questioning traditions that had governed their society for millennia, while older nobles schemed to consolidate power that might preserve their relevance in a changing world. Valerian's infiltration of Lucian's court represented just one thread in a web of conspiracies that stretched across continents, with creatures whose names appeared in forbidden histories working to destabilize vampire society from within, while positioning themselves to seize control when the inevitable collapse occurred. Marcus's reputation as the Angel of Iron Roads had reached vampire courts through networks that monitored supernatural activities, his pattern of appearing wherever predators threatened innocent humans marking him as either potential ally or dangerous enemy in conflicts that would determine the future of creatures who lived in shadows. Lucian's testing had been necessary to determine which category Marcus occupied, whether his protective instincts could be channeled toward maintaining the delicate balance that kept vampire society hidden from human awareness, or if his hunter background would drive him to expose creatures whose existence depended on mortal ignorance. The victory over Valerian had eliminated a threat that went beyond personal ambition to encompass species survival, as the ancient creature's true nature suggested connections to powers that predated both vampire and human civilization, entities whose awakening would bring apocalypse rather than mere political change. Lucian's offer came with the weight of recognition between equals, acknowledgement that Marcus had proven himself through trial by fire and blood, earning the right to stand among creatures who measured respect in centuries rather than years. The position of Seraphina's protector carried formal authority within vampire society, while the role of human liaison granted him unprecedented access to supernatural politics that most mortals never suspected existed. Marcus's negotiations demonstrated skills learned through decades of brotherhood dynamics and territorial disputes, understanding that effective alliances required mutual benefit rather than one-sided protection. He insisted on terms that would shield his Hell's Angels brothers from supernatural retaliation while establishing zones where human and vampire interests could coexist without the constant threat of exposure or exploitation. The arrangement transformed traditional power structures by recognizing that survival in a changing world required adaptation rather than rigid adherence to ancient protocols, creating precedent for cooperation that vampire courts had never considered necessary or possible. Marcus's transformation from desperate actor to genuine power broker reflected changes that went beyond his hybrid nature to encompass understanding of responsibilities that came with standing between worlds that had remained separate by necessity and tradition. The months following the trial by combat witnessed the evolution of relationships that transcended their origins in deception and desperation, as Marcus and Seraphina discovered genuine connection beneath the roles they'd been forced to play. Her centuries of isolation had created hunger for authentic relationship that went beyond the formal interactions required by royal protocol, while his protective instincts found purpose that elevated duty beyond mere survival into something approaching sacred calling. Seraphina learned about human resilience through watching Marcus navigate situations that should have destroyed him, but instead revealed depths of moral courage that vampire society had never acknowledged mortals possessed. She observed how he applied principles learned through brotherhood and hard experience to problems that seemed insurmountable, refusing to compromise core values, even when expedience suggested that flexibility might preserve life and limb. His stubborn integrity became education in characteristics that vampire nobility had dismissed as human weakness, but which proved to be sources of strength that could overcome obstacles that supernatural power alone couldn't address. Marcus discovered that Seraphina's apparent confidence masked centuries of uncertainty about her place in a world where she'd been valued for bloodline rather than character, where her opinions mattered less than her ability to produce heirs who would continue ancient traditions. Her hunger for purpose beyond royal duty resonated with his own search for meaning that went beyond revenge and protection to encompass building something positive from the ashes of past tragedy. Together, they began establishing networks that operated in spaces between official vampire society and human awareness, creating safe houses for mortals who'd been damaged by supernatural encounters, while providing refuge for vampires who sought escape from toxic bloodline politics that valued power over principles. Their work attracted creatures from both species who shared their vision of coexistence based on mutual respect rather than predator-prey relationships that had defined interactions for millennia. The foundation they built became something unprecedented in supernatural history, a diplomatic framework that acknowledged legitimate interests on both sides while establishing protocols for resolving conflicts without resorting to the violence that had traditionally characterized human-vampire interactions. Marcus's hybrid nature, made him uniquely qualified to understand both perspectives, possessing supernatural abilities that granted him credibility among vampire nobility, while retaining human empathy that allowed him to advocate effectively for mortal concerns. Serafina's position as heir to one of the most powerful vampire courts provided political weight that transformed their initiatives from charitable work into movements that could influence policy across supernatural society. Their growing influence attracted attention from other ancient bloodlines who viewed their activities as either threats to established order or opportunities to forge alliances that might prove crucial in coming conflicts. Elena became their unofficial advisor, using her position as court historian to provide context for decisions that would echo through vampire society for centuries to come. While Lucian's public support granted them protection from creatures who might otherwise have moved to eliminate what they perceived as dangerous precedent. The network they established grew to encompass safe houses in major cities, staffed by humans who understood supernatural realities, and vampires who'd chosen cooperation over exploitation, creating islands of neutrality in a world where such concepts had never existed. Their success demonstrated that alternatives to traditional power structures were possible, that creatures who'd been enemies by nature could find common ground through shared commitment to protecting rather than preying upon the vulnerable. The bond between Marcus and Serafina deepened beyond the artificial connection created through blood sharing to encompass genuine affection that neither had experienced in their respective lifetimes. She found in him the father she'd never known, someone who valued her thoughts and dreams rather than viewing her as political asset or biological necessity for continuing bloodlines. He discovered in her the daughter he'd never expected to have, someone whose courage and compassion reminded him daily that protection could be creative as well as destructive, that strength could build as well as tear down. Their relationship became model for the kind of trust that their broader diplomatic efforts sought to establish between species that had never learned to see each other as anything more than predator or prey. The transformation of their deception into authentic connection provided proof that understanding could bridge differences that seemed insurmountable, that family could be chosen rather than inherited, that love could grow from the most unlikely circumstances when nurtured by courage and commitment to principles that transcended species boundaries. As their influence expanded and their network grew to encompass creatures from multiple supernatural communities, Marcus and Serafina found themselves at the center of changes that would reshape the hidden world's relationship with human society in ways that neither had imagined when a desperate princess first approached a leather-clad stranger outside a blood bank and begged him to pretend to be her father for one night. 6 months after the trial that transformed a desperate deception into genuine alliance, Marcus operated from a fortified clubhouse that had evolved far beyond its origins as a simple biker bar into something unprecedented in either human or supernatural history. The building occupied an entire city block in the industrial district, where questions weren't asked and official attention rarely penetrated. Its reinforced walls housing meeting rooms, where vampire nobles sat across tables from werewolf pack leaders, while federal agents who'd stumbled onto supernatural realities learned to navigate politics that existed beyond any government charter. The Hells Angels chapter that called this place home had transformed into guardians of boundaries between worlds, mortals who understood the weight of secrets that could destroy civilization while protecting communities that most humans never suspected existed in the shadows of their daily lives. Marcus's brothers had adapted to their new role with the pragmatic acceptance of men who'd learned that survival sometimes required embracing impossibilities, trading their ignorance of supernatural realities for knowledge that made them invaluable mediators in conflicts where traditional authority held no meaning. The clubhouse's main floor served as neutral ground where creatures who'd been enemies for millennia could meet under protection of codes older than governments and more binding than treaties, while the basement levels contained secure facilities for refugees from supernatural conflicts who needed sanctuary from their own kind. Serafina's territory encompassed safe houses scattered throughout the metropolitan area, each one staffed by carefully selected volunteers who understood that their work involved protecting both human victims of supernatural violence and vampires seeking escape from bloodline politics that valued power over principles. Her network had grown to include therapists trained in supernatural trauma, doctors who understood unusual physiologies, and lawyers who specialized in legal problems that couldn't be solved through conventional channels. The princess who'd once been trapped by ancient traditions now commanded resources that rivaled established vampire courts, using inherited wealth and political connections to create infrastructure that served communities existing in spaces between official recognition and complete invisibility. The transformation of their partnership from desperate performance to genuine alliance had attracted attention from supernatural communities across the globe, with delegations arriving weekly to observe or challenge their unconventional approach to interspecies cooperation. Werewolf packs that had maintained territorial disputes with vampire courts for centuries found themselves grudgingly acknowledging that neutral mediation might achieve results that violence had failed to produce. While ancient creatures whose names appeared in forbidden histories emerged from hiding to test whether this new paradigm offered opportunities for coexistence they'd never dared imagine possible. Marcus's reputation as the Angel of Iron Roads had evolved into something more complex, a hybrid figure who commanded respect among creatures that measured authority in supernatural power, while maintaining credibility with human institutions that required documentation and official channels for legitimacy. His dual nature made him uniquely qualified to navigate between worlds that operated according to fundamentally different principles, translating concepts that had no equivalent across species boundaries, while building trust between groups that had survived by viewing each other as existential threats. The success of their partnership had also created dangers that neither had anticipated, as conservative elements within supernatural society viewed their activities as threats to power structures that had maintained stability for millennia. Ancient vampires who'd ruled through fear and isolation saw Marcus and Serafina's network as challenge to authority they'd never questioned, while human agencies that had built careers on maintaining public ignorance of supernatural realities found their carefully constructed cover stories undermined by evidence that monsters existed and were developing political consciousness. The fortified clubhouse had become target for extremists from multiple factions who believed that exposure or exploitation served their interests better than the careful balance Marcus and Serafina worked to maintain, requiring security measures that combined human technology with supernatural protections in configurations that had never been tested under real combat conditions. The first major crisis that would define their future emerged from tensions between werewolf packs whose territorial instincts had been inflamed by vampire expansion into regions traditionally claimed by shapeshifter communities. Pack leaders who'd accepted supernatural politics as an inevitable fact of existence found themselves facing younger wolves who questioned why ancient treaties should bind them to subservience when vampire courts commanded wealth and influence that could be seized through strategic revelation of supernatural existence to human authorities. The threat of exposure represented nightmare scenario for all supernatural communities, as government agencies that discovered the existence of creatures with superhuman abilities would inevitably seek to weaponize or eliminate them, destroying centuries of careful coexistence in favor of policies that served human interests exclusively. Marcus and Serafina found themselves coordinating response that required delicate balancing between werewolf demands for territorial justice and vampire needs for continued secrecy, while managing human officials who were beginning to notice patterns that suggested their reality was more complex than official reports acknowledged. The negotiations took place in conference rooms designed to accommodate creatures whose physical transformations could occur without warning, with security measures that could contain supernatural violence while maintaining atmosphere of diplomatic respect that made productive dialogue possible. Marcus's hybrid nature allowed him to understand werewolf concerns about territorial integrity, while his partnership with Seraphina granted him credibility among vampire nobles who might otherwise have dismissed shapeshifter grievances as irrelevant to superior species. The princess's centuries of education in vampire law provided framework for agreements that acknowledged werewolf rights while preserving the secrecy that protected all supernatural communities from human attention that could prove catastrophic for everyone involved. Their success in preventing exposure while addressing legitimate grievances established their reputation as mediators capable of bridging divides that had seemed impossible to cross, creating precedent for peaceful resolution of conflicts that had traditionally been settled through violence or political maneuvering. The resolution involved territorial adjustments that granted werewolf packs formal recognition within vampire-dominated regions, while establishing protocols for future disputes that emphasized mediation over confrontation. Human authorities who'd begun investigating unusual activities received carefully crafted explanations that satisfied official curiosity without revealing truths that would have destabilized governmental assumptions about the nature of reality itself. The success of these negotiations attracted attention from supernatural authorities across multiple continents, who recognized that Marcus and Seraphina had achieved something unprecedented in recorded history, creating framework for cooperation that could serve as model for resolving conflicts that had festered for centuries without solution. Their partnership had evolved into institution that commanded respect from creatures who'd never acknowledged mortal authority while maintaining legitimacy with human agencies that required official channels for any meaningful cooperation. As dawn broke over a city that contained more supernatural residents than most humans could imagine, Marcus found himself teaching Seraphina to ride his Harley through streets where their joint efforts had created pockets of peaceful coexistence between communities that had once viewed each other only as predators or prey. Her laughter echoed off buildings that housed safe houses and neutral meeting spaces, while her arms wrapped around his waist with trust that had grown from desperate necessity into genuine affection that neither had expected when their partnership began with deception born from mutual desperation. The motorcycle's engine growled with power that reminded Marcus of the road that had brought him to this moment. The journey from grieving brother seeking revenge to protector of communities that existed in spaces between human awareness and supernatural reality. Seraphina's joy in the simple freedom of movement represented transformation from princess, trapped by ancient protocols, to woman who'd found purpose that transcended royal duty while building legacy that would influence supernatural society for generations to come. Their success had proven that family could be chosen rather than inherited, that bonds forged through shared commitment to protecting others could transcend species boundaries and ancient prejudices that had seemed immutable for millennia. The road ahead stretched endlessly through a landscape where challenges would test their growing alliance, while opportunities emerged from connections they'd helped establish between communities that had never learned to trust each other before. Their example demonstrated that cooperation could produce results that benefited everyone involved. The sun's light caught the silver skull on Marcus's ring and the diamond pendant Seraphina wore, symbols of worlds that had learned to appreciate differences that made them stronger rather than viewing diversity as threat to stability built through isolation and mutual fear. Their story had become foundation for new understanding between supernatural and human communities, proving that monsters and mortals could learn to see each other as allies rather than enemies when guided by principles that valued protection over predation and cooperation over conquest. As they rode together through streets where their joint efforts had created zones of safety and understanding, Marcus and Seraphina represented possibility that change could come from the most unlikely sources, when courage and compassion combined with determination to build something better than what had existed before. The world they'd helped create wasn't perfect, but it was measurably better than the one they'd found when a desperate vampire princess first approached a leather-clad stranger outside a blood bank and begged him to pretend he was her father, setting in motion events that would transform both their lives and the hidden reality, where supernatural communities had learned that survival required adaptation rather than rigid adherence to traditions that no longer served their needs in a changing world.